Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Roscoe. It's a pleasure to have you here with me today. We're going to be talking about a couple of different themes that are interrelated and very important in operations management. We're going to be talking about the concept of forecasting, giving a brief overview of qualitative and quantitative forecasting techniques. We're going to be talking about managing demand as another way of planning your operational processes. And we're also going to be talking about capacity planning and how that is linked to both forecasting and demand management. So when we get into this concept of forecasting, obviously it's absolutely critical for your business. Most businesses will operate based on a forecast, and that will be gathered by a variety of different means. The forecast will really depend on a couple of factors. The forecast will depend, first of all, on the length of your production processes within your own operation, and that would be then you're using the forecast to help with your internal capacity planning. It also helps you with your hiring labor, knowing how many people you need, knowing when there's an upcoming spike in demand or a drop in demand, and planning your resources appropriately within your operation. And the length of your operational processes will then dictate how long your forecast needs to be. The other thing is forecasts can also be extended if you have a supplier who is doing your manufacturing processes. And if that supplier is located overseas, you then have to include their transportation lead times, their manufacturing times, and even their suppliers' lead times as well. And in a lot of instances, you'll have, of course, multiple suppliers who will be giving subcomponents into a final product. And you have to look at sort of the overarching timelines that would take within your supply chain. So again, the longer your supply chain is, often the longer that your forecast will need to be. Now that's important because when we talk about supply chain length and supply chain complexity, we mentioned how that increases the amount of inventory that you hold. It also means that you're going to have longer forecasts. And what I'll talk about in a little bit is the longer your forecast, the more inaccurate your forecast is, which then leads to more, guess what? Inventory, right? So the importance of forecasting. Forecast is the only estimate of demand until you get the actual order. And it helps you to plan a number of things. Of course, it helps you to plan hiring, training, when to bring on more staff. That could be full-time staff if you expect your forecast to increase on sort of a long-term basis. However, if you have a sort of an anticipated spike in demand, such as a retailer in the lead up to Christmas, you want to plan more people to be working either on your shop floor or working in your stores. And the forecast becomes important for people management. And it also helps to manage when you have a drop off sort of in January and February. You might want to look at having temporary workers, so you can bring a bunch of temporary workers in the lead up to Christmas, and then have those people laid off or moved to different parts of the operation as things slow down in January and February. So it also helps, forecast also helps you with your capacity planning. By capacity planning, I mean the capacity of your machines. It talks about the capacity of your overall operational processes, the capacity of your building. Again, if you're looking at distribution or warehousing, that's the operation that we're focusing on. If you know that there's going to be a new customer coming on board, or there's going to be a new big spike in demand that's anticipated, you might have to expand the capacity of your operation. Similarly, if there's going to be a drop in demand, such as we're heading into a recession now, you might find that warehousing space begins to contract, or companies begin to lease it off to other companies to use as a way of managing that drop in forecasted demand. The other thing is forecasts help with supply chain management. Like I mentioned before, you're going to want to be able to provide a forecast for not only your internal operations, but also for your suppliers. And that helps your suppliers to plan, which means that you'll get the materials and the resources that you need on time. Okay, so factors that impact forecasting. Obviously, time is the key factor here. And what this says is as your forecast horizon increases, your forecast accuracy, by definition, will decrease. So if I was trying to forecast for this week, I would have a fairly good understanding of what my demand is going to be. And in order to do that, I would be looking at previous week's sales. I'd be looking at the similar week last year. I might also be collecting data from the previous months, and that's going to give me a relatively good picture of what I can anticipate in the next week. However, as our forecast gets into months, 6 months into a year, into year and a half, depending on the length of our supply chain or our operation, what then happens is life, world events. So we can have all sorts of geopolitical disruptions, we can have war, we can have terrorism, we can have spread of a pandemic around the world, which disrupts all types of supply and demand, for instance, and your forecast accuracy is therefore out the window. So the longer that we have to forecast, the more inaccurate that our forecast will be. The other thing that we should remember is that as our volume increases, our overall variation in our forecast will decrease, because what we're doing is we're aggregating demand, and by having a big pool of forecasts brought together, that allows us to have relatively better forecast accuracy sort of as a percentage. Okay, so for example, if I was looking at sales for my my mom and pop shop for the following week, I might think that, okay, I'm going to sell 10 cans of pop, for instance. However, if I am a large retailer and I'm selling into 1,000 mom and pop shops, and I estimate that all of those different shops are going to be selling 10 cans, so I just take 1,000 times 10, and I end up with 10,000 cans. That becomes my aggregate forecast. What I then know is that I'll buy 10,000 cans, and I might deliver 9 to one store, 11 to another store, 8 to another, 10 to another. And as I begin to sort of spread that out over all of those different stores, what I then find is that I have more accurate forecast as a whole, because I'm looking at the aggregated sales. Okay, and this sort of idea of standardization and aggregation can reduce the amount of variability in my forecast. So aggregate and sort of group forecasts are more accurate as a percentage of forecast accuracy. So going from an individual mom and pop shop, where if I forecast for 10 items and I only sell 8, okay, my forecast accuracy is 80%. But then again, if I'm forecasting 10,000 items and I sell 9,500, my forecast accuracy is 95%. Okay, so that gives you sort of an idea when we're talking about forecast accuracy as an aggregation. All right, so when we get into forecasting techniques, what becomes apparent is we can do it in a variety of different ways. Okay, so what we can look at is qualitative forecasting methods and quantitative forecasting methods. So for qualitative forecasting methods, they're quite good for short-term predictions. They're also really good for when you're launching a new product onto the market, or you have a change in a particular product and you're not quite sure how it's going to be received by the market. Especially things with product launches, quantitative data isn't going to do you that much good, because you won't have previous sales data that you're able to crunch. You're going to be having to make a lot of assumptions, and qualitative data, and I'll give you some examples of this, will help you to have better informed decision making when you're launching a new product onto a market, or you are sort of having a variation of a new product, to understand what the market is willing to buy and willing to pay for it. So qualitative forecasting is most practical when the data is ambiguous, because it enables forecasters to use non-numerical data, qualitative data, and instead allows them to follow judgment, instinct, and their experience, as well as the experience of the people who are going to buy it. And that's sort of the most important thing. Relying on opinion over measurable data, however, can create a lot of forecasting accuracy, as you would predict, as you would sort of assume, because of people's inherent biases. When you have focus groups, when you have consumer-based focus groups, either online or in person, people can be really impressionable based on the person holding the focus group, the other people around them, what everybody else is saying. You get this sort of groupthink that can set in, and that can give you sort of biased data. Right. So qualitative forecasting techniques, I'm just going to go through some of them here. Obviously, it's not an exhaustive list. It's just to give you an understanding of different ways that we can do forecasting. And it's not always has to be quantitative-based forecasting. So some of the qualitative forecasting methods that we could use, one of them is called the Delphi study. So think about the Oracle of Delphi. It's about how do we sort of predict the future. And a Delphi study is this idea of bringing together a panel of experts and asking for their opinions on a specific business topic. So you can see in this diagram, I have this idea, I develop a questionnaire, I bring a panel of experts together, I put the questionnaire, I put the questions to the panel, they discuss it, And then what I do is I record that data and I do some qualitative data analysis on it. And that will give me some insights on where I think this particular industry is going or where this particular product is going, etc. Okay, so forecasters will collect their opinions anonymously to make their predictions. This method is effective since participants are questioned individually. In this particular instance, where you might have either the panel of experts or I'm going with a questionnaire to each individual independently, and I'm gathering sort of their future predictions. Okay. Salesforce polling is another one that's used, relies on salespeople providing insights about the future. This is really a lot of experience-based. This is the salespeople going out and talking to their big customers, getting an understanding of where the market is going, what different experts or sort of different customers are even beginning to see, and what they're willing to pay for it. And that becomes important as well. Consumer surveys, it's very common within marketing, is using interviews, questionnaires, telephone calls, focus groups, as I said before, and then performing sort of statistical analysis based on what people are saying. So they fill in a questionnaire. How likely are you to buy X, Y, and Z from 1 to 5? And then you'll do some sort of analysis based on that. Okay, the other option, of course, is quantitative forecasting. This relies on models, and really, as you can see here, what we're doing is we're crunching past data to predict future outcomes. Okay, so this ignores opinions and commentary from insiders, industry experts. What you'll often find, though, is you'll have a quantitative forecast, and that forecast will be developed, but you'll then typically have your operations manager, your marketing manager, your sales manager, supply chain manager, all sitting down looking at the forecast and thinking, okay, well, we know that this is the case, but I'm bringing on a brand new customer. This is likely to increase sales by 5%. So we need to adjust our forecast by that amount. And then the operations will take that forecast and build that quantity into their capacity plan. Okay. So usually you have an element of quantitative backward-looking data, as well as sort of the insights of the people who are working there, the salespeople, the marketing people, and the operations people will then sort of tweak the forecast based on their informed opinions to make sure that you have the most accurate forecast as possible. The other thing that's used a lot, of course, now more than ever, predictive analytics. Okay, so what artificial intelligence is now doing is basically taking all of that past data, crunching those numbers, and coming up with predictions based on artificial intelligence and this idea of sort of looking at sales trends, not just this past sales themselves, but overall trends. Predictive analytics is also very good at looking at products that were bought at the same time by certain demographics. If we look at the Amazon example as an example, Jeff Bezos has been excellent at telling consumers that if you buy this particular type of shoe, then you're also, you might also want to consider this particular type of shoelace. And they do this sort of grouping together of products, and they're able to sort of predict based on the people who buy them, their, how much they earn, where they live, and where they're likely to buy something. And then the AI predictive analytics will sort of crunch those numbers and build in this future forecast. Okay. So we have some economic modeling techniques that we can use where we look at the current economic conditions. So this is more this tends to be sort of more of a macro approach, economic modeling, where you look at current economic conditions, you bring in things like interest rates, you bring in what's going on with regulation, you look at economic analysis using sort of indicators, GDP growth, or decline in possibly in the current economic climate that we're in. You take into effect things, like I said, like recessions, where the interest rates are likely to go over the next year, because that will influence consumer purchasing habits. And then you try to predict future economic outcomes. Okay, so this uses mathematical models to predict significant economic shifts and how they might impact the economy. As I said, we're heading into a very uncertain time in terms of the global economies, likely looking like a decline in overall sort of GDP growth across a lot of economies, and that would be built into businesses' forecasts. So by comparing these multiple economic variables and internal sales data, this technique can forecast future economic developments, and then it becomes quite important in that area. a single model that utilizes sort of these multiple regression analysis and equations, tests the relationship between data points and the consistency or fluctuations of those points over time. Okay, so some of the other things that we can look at within quantitative forecasting is time series forecasting, which pulls raw data points from historical data. Then forecasters make assumptions on how things like seasonality, sort of purchasing trends, cycles over a period of time, and those trends will sort of repeat moving forward. Okay, so it looks at past fluctuations in demand, why those happened, is it seasonality, is it event related, and then they build that into future forecasts. Time series forecasting often uses line charts to present the data and is used across multiple business fields, finance, operations, and sales. There's also the indicator approach, which is done in business forecasting, depends on the relationship between indicators to forecast an economic event. Okay, so economic indicators, like I mentioned before, might include the rate of unemployment, gross domestic product or GDP, and sort of the productivity of the economy would be brought in as sort of key economic indicators. And then it studies the relationship between these different indicators and estimates future performance. Okay. So factors in forecasting method selection. So some of the things that we have to consider when selecting a forecasting method is the amount and type of data that we have available. Again, if we're launching a new product onto market, we're not going to have past sales data. The only thing we'll be able to look at is previous launches of similar products, either by our competitors, or if we're launching, the next Apple iPhone 15, we would look at the sales of the last iPhone 14, for instance. But if we're launching an entirely new product onto a market, it's very, very difficult to forecast quantitatively because we don't have past sales data. And then we would look to qualitative forecasting techniques. The degree of accuracy that we require, obviously, the more accurate, the better, but it's sort of the risk that we're willing to take. And the length of the forecast horizon, again, that can be dictated, like I said, by the length of your production processes internally. It can also be dictated by the length of your suppliers' processes, their transit time to bring products to market or to your warehouse, as well as their suppliers. You might have to forecast the entirety of the supply chain, depending on what type of product that you're making. Okay, and then also patterns in the data should be selected as well. Okay, so some of the strengths and weaknesses. I should mention that a lot of the data coming forward here in the next few slides is from operations management textbook by Nigel Slack and Alistair Brandon Jones. I'm using the 9th and the 10th edition. Highly recommend getting that book. It's always been useful for my teaching. And when we look at some weaknesses and strengths of qualitative forecasting, highly responsive to latest changes in the environment, includes insider and soft information that is very difficult to quantify, like people's opinions on what they purchase, and provides users with a sense of ownership. So the people that you're polling, the people that you're asking, become sort of owners within that process, and then they're likely to go out and spread the word for you. Weaknesses is that it can be influenced by short-term memory, by people's deficiencies, or that's their inability to sort of look at the history of previous trends, or inability to sort of see forward on looking at sort of global factors, just thinking about themselves and what they're going to buy. Difficulty in understanding relationships between trends, and obviously because people are fallible, we'll have a number of weaknesses when we're doing qualitative forecasting. And then there's all the biases that I talked about earlier, biases between other people in the focus groups, biases between the researcher that's asking the questions as well. Okay, so some of the strengths of forecasting, quantitative forecasting can consider a lot of variables and complex relationships. It is arguably more objective. Obviously, that depends on the data that you choose to include, but it's also can be consistent, looking at past data to make future predictions. Okay. Weaknesses, it's only as good as the data and the model, of course. It's slow to react to changing environments, requires an element of technical understanding, right? So when we look at, forecasting is trying to anticipate sales, the next topic I want to talk about now is what's called demand management. Okay, so demand management is essentially trying to sort of shape demand in a particular way to benefit your operation, to allow you to be able to meet demand in a more manageable way. Okay, and there's some techniques that a lot of companies use in terms of demand management. Okay, and I'm going to go through some of those today. So demand management looks at activities that assess, the profit contribution of products and customers to develop promotional strategies and share those plans across the supply chain. So demand management is something that marketing people might do, sales people might do. They might have promotions, they might have, buy one, get one free, they might have 2-for-1 sales, they might have all sorts of things. And that is also a way that we shape demand. You might use social media influencers, you might use YouTube channels to promote products or whatever it is. When marketing and sales or promoting products are essentially shaping demand. Now, demand management becomes a little bit different because then what we're trying to do is move demand in a way that we are able to match supply and demand better. Okay, so just a regular promotion is not necessarily demand management. It becomes demand management when we're trying to make sure that we have enough supply to meet that demand. So traditional marketing functions create demand, but they need to share its programs and promotional plans across the supply chain. There's nothing more difficult for an operations manager or a supply chain manager when a marketing person goes off and starts a promotion. All of a sudden, there's a huge spike in demand, and the operation's not prepared for it, and then there's not enough stock, and things sell out very quickly, and customers are disappointed because there's not enough supply. So as operations managers, when we're sort of responsible for supply, we have to have that sort of meeting in the minds between marketing and operations to share that key information. Demand management may sometimes mean decreasing demand or increasing it. So you might want to decrease demand because you don't have the capacity to satisfy it. All right. So when we just look at this, you might have sort of your business plan where you have your strategic planning. You then have your tactical planning, which is strategic planning. Again, it could be 3 to 5 year horizon. Tactical planning is sort of 1 to 2 years. And then when we get into your operational planning, we're looking sort of day to day, week to week. And then what we do is we take that strategy, and ideally we have what's called sales and operational planning, where your sales team is sitting down with your operations team and your marketing team are all sitting together looking at the demand plan, developing a forecast, and then making sure that the marketing plan and the sales plan are in line with the supply plan. So our ability to source materials, our ability to plan our capacity, to make sure we have enough people to make everything, and that all of those things are aligned. Okay, so some of the things that when we're thinking about demand management is, some demand is predictable, some demand is forecastable, meaning that we can look at past sales trends. We know roughly in the lead up to Christmas, we are going to have an increase in demand if we're a retailer. That tends to be our busiest time of the year, depending on what we're selling. We know that every year we have a similar increase, and that is able to, we're able to build those cycles and that seasonality into our forecast. Some predictable demand is cyclical forecast, annual or seasonal demand, and then variations over a day or a week. So we know that we're busy on a Friday or Saturday, and that we're very quiet on a Monday or Tuesday, for instance, depending on our business. You then have unpredictable demand, okay? And this is the demand that is very, very difficult to forecast, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the shutdown of supply, businesses all over the world shut down, as well as the shutdown in demand as we went, we were all locked down, and our demand patterns shifted very rapidly across global economies, okay? That was unpredictable. Other things that become unpredictable are extreme weather events, war, as we're seeing today, a lot of global conflict, terrorism, public relations issues. So for instance, if you have a brand issue where somebody who's promoting your product has got into hot water in the media, and all of a sudden nobody wants to buy your product because they don't want to be associated with it anymore, that can be things that are very difficult to forecast. Okay, so what businesses will do in those types of instances is they will try to shape demand in a way that becomes more manageable, that becomes more predictable. We want to get as far away from this unpredictable demand as we can to move towards more predictable demand. So some of the ways that businesses do that, I just give an example here, is when you're buying something on an online platform, they might use nudges, okay? And it's a sort of an economic phenomenon that's been applied across all sorts of marketing platforms and online platforms. Nudges are the idea where you're sort of encouraging customers in a particular direction to buy something that you're trying to sell them or something similar, a related product. In this particular example, I just highlighted a Nike Air shoe. It says the Nike Air Vapor Max Plus was bought over 100 times this week. So you better buy it while it's hot. It's popular and everybody else is out buying it, okay? And then I can charge you £169 for it because you think that, well, people have bought it for the same amount and must be cool, it must be trendy, so I'm going to go ahead and buy it. And what they're trying to do here is nudge you to make that purchase. Other things that businesses will use, obviously, are Groupons and off-peak deals. So the idea with managing demand using Groupon, or encouraging people to have go for happy hour on a Tuesday, is because that is the quietest time of the week. So what they do is they use these promotions to bring people in when the business is really quiet. You can see here for this Spanish restaurant, tapas dishes and cocktails for 2 or 4 people at this particular cafe, and you can get up to 48% off if you come with 3. You buy these 3 dishes, and we'll give you up to 10% off, maximum 50 quid, and then it can see all the different discounts here. So basically what they're trying to do is sort of encourage demand, and making sure that you buy that Groupon as quickly as possible so they can bring people in during quieter times. Okay. Other things that businesses are using much more now than they certainly used to is dynamic pricing. So if you've ever gone on to look at an airline ticket, and airline tickets are highly changeable, and it changes for a variety of reasons. So it'll be cheaper to fly on a Wednesday than it will be on a Friday, because more people fly on a Friday for the weekends. You also have in England, they call it half term. So there's half term pricing where all of the kids are off, and airlines will double their prices just because they can. And you have sort of this dynamic pricing based on the time of the week, as well as during the time of the year, where it gets more and more expensive in the lead up to Christmas. Happy hours at pubs and bars. A lot of bars are now using this, where it is cheaper to buy a beer sort of at 6 o'clock in the evening, and as the evening goes on and we get closer to sort of 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, then they begin charging more and more for a pint of beer. And because people are drinking more, they're willing to pay more. And by the end of the night, you're ending up paying $12 a beer instead of 6. Okay. Other examples here are stock market movements. Obviously, the rapid change in pricing on stocks and bonds is an idea of dynamic pricing. Okay, we're seeing a lot more of this across a lot of different industries. And it's becoming a very popular way of managing demand, as well as exploiting profitability. The other good example that I always like is Tesco. They're very good at looking at the deliveries of their products. This is based in the UK. It's also been applied all across the world. You can see here they use dynamic pricing, different days of the week. They tell you when it's unavailable. It'll also tell you when it becomes more expensive, depending on the day. So $5.50 here for most of these slots, but they will do, it could be less at 9 in the morning when people go off to work, and then more in the evenings when people are back home. Okay. So other things is, sorry, just jumped ahead here, public relations campaigns. So you can use applied media pressure, applied government pressure to get people to stop doing a particularly harmful habit. I use smoking here as an example. Having labels such as these ones on cigarettes to get people to stop smoking, or to at least make it unappealing. So less and less people do it, and has been very effective. Applied pressure to get people off of cigarettes. The sugar tax is another good example. That's being in the UK, to have, the idea there is you increase the price on sugary drinks, and in theory, people will buy less of it, and that then less sugar leads to less obesity, less diabetes, less rotten teeth, for instance. So public marketing campaigns can also influence demand. Okay, so some of these ideas, when we bring them together, though, when we're trying to forecast, we're trying to manage our demand, what we're trying to understand then is how do these demand factors begin to influence our production capacity. So how much we're able to make within our particular operation. So production capacity looks at the maximum level of value-added activity that an operation can achieve over a period of time. Again, we return to this idea of value adding. Value adding is essentially particular process or particular activity where you are transforming a product or a person, and the beneficiary of that operation sees it as something that adds value to them. Okay, so if I'm making a particular product, when I'm physically making the product, that is a value adding activity. Or if I'm a person, I'm going through a hotel, and I'm meeting with the staff, or I'm having, I don't know, a spa, or I'm meeting at a restaurant, that is value adding activities. Non-value adding activities, again, is when I'm waiting around, waiting to check in, waiting to get my room ready. All of that stuff is non-value adding activities, okay? So when we look at production capacity, we have to look at the resources that we have available that we can serve our customers with to make our products, and the mix of our people, our systems, and our equipment, okay? And that all feeds into our capacity. So when we look at this idea of productivity, we're looking at the amount of outputs divided by the inputs that we have coming into our process. And productivity would translate here into this idea of output rate or throughput rate that we've discussed in previous lectures. Okay, so when we're managing capacity, we look at our short-term capacity adjustments, overtime and temporary staff. We look at our flexible capacity. So what is our, how many temporary workers do we have, if at all? Can we change our shift patterns? Are we currently running, one shift? Can we increase that from 8 hours a day to 16 hours a day? Or can we run, 3 shifts at 24 hours a day and lead up to a very, very busy time of the year? Can we stagger our working hours, etc.? Changing capacity plans, we can change the form and the nature of our capacity plans. And some of the different things that we can do is we can use like a level capacity plan where we make the same amount every single day. Or we can do what's called a chase capacity plan, where we're sort of chasing the demand or chasing our forecast. Or we could do a sort of a mix of chase and a level plan, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So the idea here, though, is what we're trying to do is understand our forecast, the time horizon of our forecast, and we are trying to then plan our capacity based on that. If the forecast is a year, we're trying to plan the capacity of our building. We're trying to plan our vehicles and our equipment over a year. But as we then go to 6 months, then we make different decisions on hiring temporary workers. And as we go to a month, we're then getting into the people need to be hired, they need to be trained and in position. And then if we're going to a week, we need those workers sort of started and working now. So that's when you can make short-term capacity adjustments, or we can make long-term capacity adjustments, and we can use things like flexible staff or workers to sort of scale up and down our production capacity. The other thing that we could do, in theory, is if we had a year, we could also look at bringing on new machines or new equipment in order to ramp up our overall production capacity. Okay, so essentially what we're trying to do here is, like I said before, is over that period of time, what we want to do is when we're forecasting over long time horizons, we want to aggregate our demand, and we want to think about, over the next year, this is my anticipated demand. I have a year to make it, and this is how I can sort of ramp up to reach that ideally increased demand. Now, the other thing that we have to think about is, over a year, like I said, do we need a bigger warehouse, a bigger distribution center, more trucks, more people in order to meet that demand? But then as our timeline begins to shrink, we then think about, okay, well, how do we actually move from capacity planning to what's called sort of control of the operation? We move from planning to control, and control becomes like, how do we have people in place on a day-by-day basis to meet that particular forecast? Okay, so some of the different capacity plans that we can use to do this, I'll give you a few examples. One of them, like I said before, is a level capacity plan. The other one is a chase demand plan or chase capacity plan, and then a mixed plan. And I'll go through some of these and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, so here you can see the demand of a hotel over a year. A hotel is interesting because you tend to have a building with fixed rooms, and what you're trying to do is your demand is obviously going to fluctuate, and sort of the lead up to Christmas, it might get a little bit busier. Depending on the summer, depending on what type of hotel you're running, it could also be very busy, and then very quiet in sort of January and February, March, for instance. But your capacity in terms of the rooms are fixed. And now what you can do, though, is as you get busier and as you're ramping up to full capacity, you bring people into the operation. You bring people in to manage the restaurants, to manage the front desk, to manage the cleanup, etc. And all of that is sort of planned around your forecasted demand. If we're looking at making woolen knitwear, for instance, we are going to have seasonality in our demand. We're going to go from January, where we're selling off what we've already made, and then we're ramping up during summer, where it's very quiet, and our demand is ramping up all the way to Christmas, where is sort of the winter months where things get busier. Aluminum producer, as you can see, when we're making commodity, ideally we should have sort of an increase in demand on a month-by-month basis. And that is going up incrementally because we're making this mass commodity. We want to have very predictable, very forecastable demand because we're not able to adjust our capacity very quickly when we're making mass commodities. Finally, with a retail store in this instance, we might be, let's say we're an H&M. We know that we're going to be quieter during the summer, but then in the lead up to Christmas, we're going to have more and more sales. So we take these sort of aggregated demand. This could be, we're broadening out in H&M, not just at one particular store in Vancouver. We're looking at all of their stores across the Lower Mainland. And we might even aggregate demand even further if we're going out, if our forecast is expanding to include Alberta, to include all of Canada, if we're looking for sort of a 1 to 2 year long forecast. Okay, so what a level capacity plan would basically mean that if we're running a hotel, like I said, we have fixed capacity. Our capacity plan will be sort of level, and then what we do is we just have full-time workers, full-time cleaners, full-time people working behind the desk, and they're there every day of the year. That means that we'll probably have to have those people based on our maximum amount of demand, which would be in this example in November. And we would base all of our hiring decisions based on that peak of demand because we don't want to underserve our customers. So that means that in a lot of instances, we're going to be underutilizing those workers. So we're going to have a lot of workers sitting around for a lot of months, except for November. In a retail store, similarly, we have a fixed space. We have our store shelves. We're maybe not able to expand because we're in a mall, for instance, and we just have 2 or 3 workers, and we bring them in, and they just full-time workers all the way through the year, and they're able to meet the demand at Christmas time. So that becomes sort of a level capacity plan based on our resources that we have. That's our equipment, that's as well as our human resources. Now, when we look at, that's the process. So this gives you an overview of what level capacity planning is there. When we then look at other types of level capacity plan, if we look at the aluminum producer, what we can do is something different. Is we could set a level based on our forecast. So if we're forecasting a year out, we know that our demand is going to be increasing month on month. But what we don't want to do is overproduce all year. So we don't want to set our level capacity at our December rate. What we want to do is set it here at our June rate. Okay, and what we do is we overproduce for the first 6 months of the year, and then we take all of that overproduction and we basically hold it as inventory, and we then deliver it to our customers in the months that follow when our demand peaks. Okay, so you can see that little chunk is being moved from our overproduction to satisfy demand. Same thing with the woolen knit factory. When we're quiet, we take our overproduction here from February to August, and we move it to satisfy demand in the winter months. Okay, this is quite common with a lot of businesses. It does lead to a lot of excess inventory, of course, which can create additional costs for the business. But it does mean that you're able to have the same workforce, the same machines running at the same pace. It's very predictable, always doing the same thing day in and day out, and that can drive down costs in terms of standardization. It also means that you don't have to bring in a bunch of temporary workers and train them and then lay them off. All right. The other thing that we can do is use a chase capacity plan. So a chase capacity plan is you're trying to match capacity or production, the amount that you make, closely to the varying levels of forecasted demand. It requires different numbers of staff, working hours, and different amounts of equipment. It's not ideal for standard perishable products, non-perishable products. It is not ideal for, it's ideal for perishable goods and those products with highly variable demand, okay? Because what we're having to do is we're constantly having to change how much we make and when we make it, and basically that means that we have to build in a lot of flexibility into our processes, and it can cost a lot of money. But it also means that we are more responsive to demand, okay? A lot of times in this type of operation, you're gonna have a very responsive, agile operation, short production lead times, and you're sort of making to order instead of making to stock, all right? So this example shows you that I'm trying to chase demand. I make the similar amount for 3 months here for aluminum. I step up that demand, then I make it from, you can see April to, June. I make the same for 3 months. And the same thing with the woolen knit factory. is I'll bring temporary workers on and then I'll lay them off as I get quiet in the summer, and then I'll have to rehire them and retrain them. Okay, again, there's going to be a lot of cost there with hiring and retraining, and that builds costs into the business. Okay. You can see here similarly with the hotel, again, our space would be the same, but we're bringing workers on and off as we go through the year. Similarly with the retail store. Okay, so you're trying to chase demand as closely as possible. It does rely either on a very quick response or a very accurate forecast. The other thing that we can do is a mixed capacity plan. So what you can see here is we might overproduce in 1 month. So it's February. We take that block from February and we can move it to, in this example, November, or we take it from August and we move it to a busier period during the year. Okay, so that is basically a mix of a chase plan and a level plan. So we're level from March until July, and then we sort of begin to chase demand again as we get busy. Okay, so that gives you some idea of different ways that businesses can look at their forecast. They can build in flexibility to use this chase plan, or they can build in standardization, repetition to take advantage of costs. It really does depend on your business model and the type of product that you're selling. So I do hope that that is informative and interesting, and I will leave it there. Please subscribe and like the video, and there'll be many more to come after this. So thank you everybody for your time, and I look forward to seeing you back here soon.